Opening the English with c4 immediately stakes a claim on the d5 square, influencing the center from the flank. Developing the knight offers flexibility, preparing to control the center and potentially supporting pawn advances later. Developing the knight to c3 directly supports the d4 advance, aiming for central control and preparing to expand. Immediately challenging white's central pawn creates dynamic imbalances. Sharpening the kingside, g3 aims to fianchetto the bishop, controlling the long diagonal and preparing for castling. Challenging the center immediately creates dynamic possibilities and demands immediate attention from white's pieces. Opening the center and freeing pieces, white embraces a dynamic battle. Reclaiming the pawn immediately opens up the center, creating immediate central tension and potential for piece activity for black. The bishop now eyes the d5 pawn, preparing to contest central influence. Shifting the knight to c7 aims to bolster the central pawn structure, preparing for a potential e6 advance to liberate the bishop. Unlocking the queenside pawn chains potential, while developing the knight toward the center creates a solid foundation for central control and potential kingside expansion. Fortifying the central knights and reinforcing the d5 pawn, this solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn breaks like e6. It sets up a symmetrical knight structure, hinting at a positional battle where precise maneuvering will be key rather than immediate tactical fireworks. This also allows for the development of the queen's bishop to f5 or g4, further activating black's queenside. A timely castle secures the monarch, clearing the way for potential queenside play and freeing the rook. Black boldly grabs central space, challenging white's kingside fianchetto and opening lines for their own pieces, particularly the queen and dark-squared bishop, while potentially creating dynamic play on the queenside. Preparing to eye the queenside and potentially anchor a bishop on the strong c4 square, this maneuver also prepares for a future d4 push, aiming to seize central space and restrict black's pieces. It's a patient build-up, seeking to outmaneuver rather than directly attack, slowly expanding white's influence along the third rank. Solidifying the pawn chain's integrity and preparing for a central pawn push, the bishop now finds a safe haven, eyeing the queenside while white's fianchettoed bishop on g2 faces a potential challenge. Positioning the bishop on this long diagonal unlocks its potential, adding pressure towards the queenside and preparing for future pawn expansion, while subtly limiting black's knight's scope. Solidifying the kingside structure by bringing the monarch to safety is a prudent choice, ensuring the castled position can withstand potential central pawn pushes and opening up the rook for future defensive or offensive maneuvers on the newly opened files. Asserting dominion over the semi-open c-file is paramount here, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around their king. Solidifying the central pawn structure, f6 prepares to contest the e4 square and supports the knight on c6, while subtly aiming to prevent white's pieces from easily infiltrating the kingside. A subtle repositioning aimed at reinforcing the d4 square and potentially rerouting the knight to a more active central outpost, perhaps c2 or d3, while simultaneously freeing the f3 square for a pawn push or knight jump. Unleashing the bishop from its pawn chains, black aims to activate this piece and potentially pressure white's queenside structure. Unleashing the knight to the rim with this cavalry sortie, white aims to exploit the kingside pawn structure's potential weakness by creating pressure along the queenside diagonal, potentially rerouting the knight to c5 or even b6 to disrupt black's solid setup. A cautious advance, the knight repositions to a less active square, creating a subtle pawn chain imbalance and potentially preparing for a queenside expansion, while relinquishing central influence and opening the d-file for white's rooks. Shifting the knight from the rim toward the center prepares to challenge black's queenside pawn structure and potentially secure the d4 square, offering a more dynamic presence than its previous station. Diverting the queen to d7 aims to support the e5 pawn and prepare for potentially activating the queenside bishop, while also eyeing the c6 square as a future landing spot for other pieces, creating a more cohesive defensive setup and subtly shifting the burden of initiative back to white. Reclaiming central influence, this knight embarks on a journey to secure the d5 square and potentially bolster the queenside's defensive structure, aiming to disrupt black's relatively passive development. A developing piece, the bishop now eye a crucial diagonal, preparing to reinforce the queenside and potentially challenge white's control of the c-file. Solidifying the center now helps white organize its pieces for potential action on the queenside, while also preparing to challenge black's pawn structure. Asserting control over the d4 square with the knight, black aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create imbalances, potentially forcing a pawn exchange that could open lines for black's pieces. Steering the knight back into the fray from its awkward perimeter station on a4, this repositioning aims to reintegrate white's forces, creating potential for a central pawn push or a more active knight presence on squares like d5 or e4. It's a pragmatic regrouping, acknowledging the somewhat passive placement of the piece and seeking to restore some dynamic potential after black's solid setup. This subtle shift prepares for future pawn breaks, possibly on d4 or e4, aiming to unlock white's queenside and challenge black's comfortably anchored pieces. It also guards against any immediate tactical intrusions black might have been contemplating. A bold sortie into enemy territory, this knight boldly aims to disrupt white's meticulously constructed pawn chain, potentially opening up lines for counterplay on the queenside and forcing a decision from the opponent regarding the d3 pawn and its defenders. White redirects the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the d4 knight and preparing to potentially support a central pawn push or challenge black's queenside structure. Black establishes a formidable presence on the d-file, preparing to contest its control and potentially exploit the open lines that might arise, while simultaneously reinforcing the knight on d4, turning it into a crucial central outpost. White reclaims the initiative with this piece redistribution, aiming to challenge black's somewhat passive central blockade and prepare for potential action on the kingside. Black boldly injects life into the center, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and open lines for his own pieces, particularly the queen, which now has a clearer path forward. The knight hops to a central outpost, eyeing the weakened d6 pawn and the possibility of disrupting black's coordination, though it does commit the piece to a potentially exposed square should black advance the e-pawn. Boldly anchoring the bishop to f6 solidifies black's central control and prepares for further pawn advances or piece maneuvering, potentially eyeing the d3 pawn. Injecting a rook onto the d-file aims to contest it, potentially preparing a pawn advance or creating attacking possibilities should black's defenses falter. This maneuver throws a wrench into white's queenside aspirations, aiming to disrupt the established pawn structure and gain breathing room for black's pieces. The advance on b5 forces white to confront the potential pawn lever, potentially opening lines for black's rooks or creating weaknesses in white's kingside defense if not handled carefully. Repositioning the knight to b2, white aims to reroute it to a more active square, potentially targeting c4 or d3, while simultaneously freeing the c2 square for the rook's eventual advancement. This subtle maneuvering signals an intention to improve piece coordination and prepare for a more assertive central or queenside action, countering black's growing pawn presence. Black gambles with the pawn thrust, injecting immediate dynamic complexity and forcing white to confront the unleashed energy on the kingside. Repositioning the knight to a more active square is a sensible idea, seeking to challenge black's central pawn thrust and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. Sacrificing a knight to break open the kingside and exploit white's uncastled king is a bold, aggressive thrust, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn shield and inject immediate tactical chaos into the position. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight creates a dynamic pawn majority for black on the kingside and opens lines toward white's still-castled king. This trade fundamentally alters the positional landscape, promising sharp play ahead and forcing white to confront the immediate threat of black's advanced pawns while also potentially freeing up black's pieces for more aggressive endeavors. The pawn capture liberates the f-file, immediately activating black's rook and creating immediate threats on the king's side, forcing white to react defensively. Reclaiming the initiative on the queen's diagonal opens up lines of attack, but it leaves the king curiously exposed as the central pawns shatter, creating a complex web of tactical possibilities. Resuming the initiative by placing the rook on a more active file, aiming to pry open the c-file for potential pressure. Unlocking the center with this pawn thrust aims to shatter black's compact formation and introduce dynamic play, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Asserting central control via pawn capture, 25. Cxd4 immediately unlocks the c8 rook and opens lines for future activity, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially target weaknesses on the queen side or even a centralized king if white misplays. Opening the d-file now presents a pivotal opportunity to exploit the misplaced black knight and the unprotected nature of white's king. Unleashing the bishop to g5 aims to exploit the now open g-file and the potential weakness around white's castled king, but it risks overextending and becoming a target before the army can effectively support it. Opening the d-file presents a double-edged sword, forcing black to confront the newly exposed diagonal and potentially solidifying white's central control if black mismanages the ensuing tension. A strategic repositioning begins as the bishop retreats, aiming to protect the vulnerable pawns on the queen side and potentially redeploy to a more active diagonal, perhaps e7 or d7, to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for a future kingside attack. A bold commitment to locking down the queen side, aiming to suffocate black's queenside initiative and potentially create opportunities on the kingside later. Reinvigorating the queenside initiative, this maneuver aims to liberate the pinned rook and prepare for a potential pawn storm, simultaneously challenging white's central control and creating dynamic counterplay. Reclaiming the queenside initiative, white's qf1 subtly prepares to contest the open c-file, aiming to disrupt black's established defensive structure and potentially exploit the weak squares around the black king that are becoming apparent. Exchanging that bishop immediately clears the d-file for your opponent's rook and opens a direct diagonal for white's queen towards your king. The piece sacrifice was intended to create a passed pawn, but this trade effectively neutralizes that threat while giving white more active piece play. Reclaiming the open column with the rook solidifies control over the crucial c-file, addressing black's recent pawn advance and positioning for potential future operations. A daring recapture, immediately challenging the central pawns and opening a vital diagonal for the queen. Reclaiming the central fight for the d-file while preparing to develop the knight to a more active square, possibly e5 or c5, aiming to disrupt black's potentially solidifying pawn structure and gain influence in the crucial central squares. Unburdening the king of its immediate defensive duties allows for a cascade of exchanges, potentially simplifying into an endgame where black's active pieces can exert greater influence on the open files. Regaining the bishop clears a critical diagonal for white's queen, immediately putting pressure on black's advanced pawns and creating a potential outpost for the knight on d3, hinting at a squeeze on the kingside. Seizing initiative by sacrificing material to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and open lines near the king is a bold statement, aiming to exploit the newly created weaknesses rather than playing passively. The knight jumps into the heart of black's weakened kingside, seeking to exploit the open lines and the exposed f3 pawn, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure. Unleashing the bishop from its long confinement, a bold repositioning that aims to disrupt white's central grip and activate a previously passive piece, creating newfound attacking potential on the queen side.